That's super. So welcome everybody. My name is Ray Locke. I'm Chief Executive of the Forces and Mind Trust, and welcome to the Living in Our Shoes event today. It's not really a launch event. The report was published back in June last year, but it has given people the opportunity to provide some informed comment on what has been written. I recognise that with COVID-19, this perhaps is not at the top of everybody's agenda, but it certainly is for us today. And I hope, if anything, the pandemic has highlighted the importance of the armed forces community to the nation. And today is about the importance of the families as key members of that armed forces community. A couple of housekeeping notes from me. As an attendee, you won't be able to interact on voice or video, but you will be able to put comment and questions into the Zoom chat tote, and I would encourage you please to do that. The recording of the webinar will be made publicly available, and we're going to put it on the Forces in Mind Trust Zoom YouTube channel. If you haven't got hold of the report, you can find it. It was on the link to your Eventbrite invitation, but of course it's very easy to find on Google, Living in Our Shoes. There is an opportunity to provide comment after the event, and you can do that by emailing through to robert.selby100@mod.gov.uk. Thank you, Robert, for accepting that challenge. And of course, if you are on social media, then delighted if you could tweet along with today and afterwards using the hashtag Living in Our Shoes. Let's just pop up the agenda, please, Rodrigo, just to cover what we're going to be doing today. First of all, we have a pre-record from the lead reviewer, Andrew Selous MP, followed by the report findings from Professor Walker. We are hoping very much that the Secretary of State for Defence is going to be dashing across from the House of Commons, across less than 7 miles, so that's easy. And then he'll be making a formal response on behalf of the MOD, and he should be accompanied at some stage by the Chief of Defence People. We've got the Families Federation view. Again, we have some pre-recorded comment from them. And we also have some live discussion as well, where we'll bring in Kate Davies, who is the Director of Armed Forces, NHS England. You've got the hashtag and you've got the email address for post-event comment. And again, we'll put those up at the end of the event. So that's it with the agenda. In terms of the independent review, then it was conducted by the lead reviewer, Andrew Selous MP. He was assisted by Emeritus Professor Jan Walker from Newcastle University and Dr. Gabriella Miska from the University of Worcester. I spoke to Andrew last week about the report, and this is what Andrew had to say. Well, we're delighted to be able to start the event today, Living in Our Shoes, with the lead reviewer, Andrew Selous MP. Andrew has been Member of Parliament for South West Bedfordshire for nearly 20 years now. He served in government within the Treasury and the Ministry of Justice. He was a former member of the Territorial Army, the Royal Regiment Fusiliers, and also the Honourable Artillery Company. So delighted you could join us today, Andrew.
Very nice to be with you, Ray. Great pleasure. Thank you.
So let me kick off then by asking you, first of all, why did you accept the invitation from the Secretary of State for Defence to do this review in the first place?
Well, it was a great honour to be asked to do this review by Gavin Williamson. As you said, I'm a former Territorial Army soldier myself. My father was in the Navy. My mother actually had quite a difficult time as a naval wife when she was first married to him. And my niece is married to someone in the Royal Air Force, and I've listened to some of the issues which she has had to cope with. So it's quite personal, and I've got a very strong interest politically in supporting families, something I've spent quite a lot of time on in Parliament.
So how did you go about gathering the evidence for the review?
Well, we travelled around the whole country. We had a big written call for evidence. We always made sure when we went on to military bases that we got time to speak with families without any senior officers being present, so they could talk to us absolutely frankly. We went into a number of schools to talk to service children. We thought that was really important as well. So we've really tried to listen very hard to represent the lived experience of service families, and it took us about 18 months to sort of gather the evidence and really travel around the UK get the evidence for the report.
And of course, the report itself was published back in June. So the period between then and now, I would imagine we'll have the chance to hear later on from people what they actually think of it as well, which would be helpful.
Yes, it was very nice. I got a nice letter from the Prime Minister just before Christmas saying that the report has been well received across government. So I'm looking forward to the recommendations hopefully being accepted by the government by the spring, I think was the date mentioned.
Okay, so I mean, how are you going to hold the government to account for implementing these recommendations?
The final recommendation is that there should be a 6-monthly sort of public review of the implementation of the recommendations. And I'm particularly grateful actually to the former Chief of Defence People, General Nugi, who was very, very keen that this should be a report that didn't just gather dust on a shelf. So I think that 6-monthly public transparency of how the recommendations are being implemented is really important. That means that members of Parliament can ask what is happening or not happening at defence questions in the House of Commons. The Defence Select Committee can hold the government to account as well. So hopefully if that recommendation is implemented, which I very much want it to be, there will be a robust implementation mechanism there.
Good, and of course we'll hear from General Nugi's successor, General Swift, later on in today. So it'll be good to ask him that same question. I just wonder, Andrew, do you know what plans the devolved administrations have for implementing these recommendations?
Well, in the letter that I got from the Prime Minister on the 22nd of December, he said that the report has been well received by the devolved administrations as well as other government departments other than the Ministry of Defence and indeed the charitable sector as well. And I know there's been a lot of consultation, you know, by the Westminster government with all the devolved administrations. We went to Wales, we went to Scotland, we spoke to Brigadier Swift, who was the commander in Northern Ireland. So we have taken a lot of time to try and really reflect the context in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales.
Good. And we hope there will be people on the call today who will also be able to fill their ideas in as well on the chat, which we'll come back to. What about the charity sector? You mentioned that it had been well received by the charity sector, but you know, how do you hold them to account, or can you hold them to account for implementing the recommendations in your review?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say, Ray, is I think we're extremely fortunate in this country to have such a fantastic services charitable sector. And I think FIMT has just done a major report on that. You kindly sent me a copy of it a couple of days ago. So thank you for that. So, you know, that is a tremendous advantage. One of the things we're calling for, in the way that we already have a veterans gateway, we want there to be a service families gateway. So it's really easy to find the help you're looking for in the part of the country that you are in. At the moment, I think you have to be a little bit of a sort of expert navigator sometimes, you know, to find what you need where you are. And, you know, perhaps a little bit of collaboration and sort of collective working by charities would be helpful as well. But I think that service families gateway would be really, really helpful on a much more local level. I mean, we've talked about the charitable sector, but I think the voluntary sector, you know, things like sort of welcoming committees when you come to a new area. One Army wife said, you know, she got to Northern Ireland. It's only when she was leaving she realised there was some horse riding, which you know, she only found out as she was going. That would have been something her children would have enjoyed. That sort of thing would be quite easy to put right. There's a local scout group, for instance, and there's a year's waiting list, you know, and a service child only has a posting for 2 years in one place. It might be really nice if that scout group might give some prioritisation to the service child, so they didn't miss out. So I think it's the voluntary sector as well as the charitable sector that we would like to see stepping up.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I mean, I left the Air Force 8 years ago now, but I remember a similar thing with my children and scout and cub packs and things like that. So I guess, you know, that was 8 years ago. I mean, do you think there's going to be a need to repeat this review in another 5 years' time?
Well, I think what we need is to get the government to accept as many of the recommendations as possible. There are 110 of them. We then need that robust implementation, which we've called for in the report. So probably I would hope this would stand the test of time for a good 5 years or so. But of course, the demands on family life, the opportunities for families are going to change. This will be a constantly evolving picture. So absolutely, this will have to be looked at again at some point in the future. But it is quite a big piece of work. There are 110 recommendations here. So I think the first thing is just to get going on putting those into practice.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, I mean, we're going to hear from the Secretary of State next, Ben Wallace, but if you were in his position, what would be your priorities now then, Andrew?
I think recruitment and retention is just so important for all the armed forces. In America, they have the expression, recruit the person, retain the family. And recommendation 96 is to the Prime Minister to really spearhead a sort of national effort to prioritise the care of armed forces families. And I think just resetting the dial a bit, I think we've moved a lot as a country to look after veterans much better than we did, which is absolutely fantastic. I don't want to take anything away from that. I just think we need, as a whole country, it's absolutely not just for the Ministry of Defence, it's for everyone. We need to do the same thing for armed forces families, because they are sometimes invisible, but they are indispensable to a strong defence.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And finally, I mean, you have the opportunity now to speak directly to some of those families. What is your message to serving and former serving families?
I think what I'd say is we've tried really hard to listen to you. We tried to do a lot more listening than talking. So what I want to say to you is that we hear you, we see you, we know that your life has often not been easy. I don't think there is any other group of public servants' families who have to endure as much separation, relocation and danger as armed forces families have to. So I think we owe you a very high duty of care. This report is a serious attempt to reflect what your lives are like and to try and make them better. And I will be taking a very close interest in making sure that the recommendations are followed through.
Andrew, thank you. We'll hear from you later on the panel discussion. But for now, Andrew Selous, MP, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was recorded last week. So what we'll do now is move on to a summary of the report. I should just explain, Forces in Mind Trust believes that successful, sustainable transition from military to civilian life requires the family as well as the service person to make that transition journey. We also believe that if we create good evidence and we give that good evidence to policymakers, they're likely to make good policy. So this is very much what today is all about, and why we've invested some of our National Lottery endowment in funding the independent review itself. Now, the report itself it's about 268 pages long, but rather than try and wade through all of that, last week again, we asked the lead reviewer, Professor Jan Walker, to produce a bit of a summary of findings for us. And we've got a 17-minute clip now, so we're going to play that to find out what actually is in the Living in Our Shoes.
Secretary of State, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to highlight some of the key findings which shaped our recommendations. As Andrew has said, our aim was to give UK Armed Forces families a voice and to shine a spotlight on the lived experiences of military personnel of all ranks and backgrounds. Our findings are supported by a large body of international research which highlights very similar issues facing armed forces families throughout the world. Our report draws on the words of the men, women and children who shared their concerns, some of which are included today as background to my comments. Armed forces families constitute a diverse population and face the same challenges and have the same expectations of family life as civilian families. And Andrew has mentioned some of the additional challenges they experience, which were the focus of our review. First, the obligations inherent in military service put operational effectiveness and commitment to duty first as the #1 priority. Family life is secondary. Second, the level of required mobility and repeated periods of separation are unparalleled in civilian life. and military families live with the knowledge that their loved ones may face the kind of danger which results in the ultimate sacrifice. Nevertheless, serving personnel stressed how much they love their work and express pride in their military career, sentiments echoed by their partners and their children. No one was looking for special treatment, and many apologised for feeling compelled to share negative views. Overall, we found military families to be accepting of their obligations, resilient, stoic, largely uncomplaining, and proud. There is a sense, however, that the vital role that they play and the pressures they face are rarely acknowledged. A heartfelt plea from an army wife provided the title for our report. Along with others, she wanted someone to live in the shoes of family members to understand what it is like for them. And a detailed response from a naval family set the context for our inquiries. They pointed to the benefits of military life and also the challenges resulting from mobility and separation, many of which they felt could be avoided, and which taken together result in cumulative negative impacts. Long periods of separation, which can result in loneliness, isolation, and pressures on parenting, personal relationships, and mental health. Frequent moves which disrupt children's education, the career opportunities of non-serving partners, friendships, continuity in healthcare, and the inability to plan family activities and create a stable family environment. Many of these impacts make it difficult to balance the obligations of military service with the desire for stability in family life. Serving personnel frequently miss special occasions and children's key milestones, and time apart can undermine the quality of couple relationships. While families get used to repeated periods of separation, the emotional stress often gets harder. Our review highlights just how many relationships suffer and how grateful RAF and Royal Navy couples are to be able to access confidential, independent professional counselling. This kind of support is very much valued. It is well recognised that military life also creates unique stresses for children. They have to adjust to repeated absence of their parents. They have to change schools when the family is moved, and that means making new friends. So while deployments are a normal and accepted requirement of being in the military, there is strong research evidence that the longer the time spent away, the greater the negative impact for children, and the greater the stress on family relationships. The Royal Navy experiences the longest deployments, sometimes up to 9 months, which is considered as too long, especially for children, who can be confused and upset when a parent comes home and then goes away again for long periods. Ensuring that adults and children understand the emotional cycle of deployment and are supported throughout are essential for their well-being. Families called for better support, and for children and young people to have access to a confidential professional helpline. Like deployments, mobility is a feature of service life, meaning a number of changes, and it's army families who tend to move the most frequently. Young people recounted attending up to 8 schools as commonplace, some in different countries with different curricula. This is particularly problematic for children with special educational needs and disabilities, some of whom miss months of schooling each time the family moves. Concerns have been expressed about how mobility impacts on children's educational attainment, but much more rigorous, in-depth research is needed to fully understand the impacts and the longer-term outcomes. Young people pointed out that stability in their teenage years is key to overcoming some of the difficulty experienced with changes of schools when they're younger. We know that some military children are carers for a parent with long-term health issues, and that the support needs of these children are frequently overlooked. Evidence suggests that many military children cope well with the changes they experience. They're immensely proud of having a parent in the military, and they build resilience, confidence, and adaptability. For others, mobility and parental absence impacts negatively on their well-being and results in uncertainty, low self-esteem, and anxiety. Parents talked about the emotional whiplash that children experience, and these impacts can be even more acute for children in dual-serving families, and serving mothers describe the difficulty of balancing the role of mother with the demands of a military career. Teachers and parents were vocal about the importance of promoting greater continuity in education and finding better ways to supporting children both academically and emotionally. And we have made a bold, overarching recommendation for all the governments of the UK to make getting it right for service children an educational priority, and to take all the necessary steps to ensure that service children, especially those with special educational needs and disabilities, are not disadvantaged by service life. Frequent moves can make it difficult for non-serving partners to pursue their own employment. Many partners have to change jobs and are frequently told they are overqualified for what they regard as more menial jobs. And employers are sometimes reluctant to employ them because they know that the family will be moving again. And we did find examples of blatant discrimination. Families also describe the challenge of finding accessible and affordable childcare because of long waiting lists around the country. There is growing evidence that unemployment and underemployment have serious consequences for family finances, health and well-being, which can result in pressure on the serving partner to leave the military. Employment, on the other hand, increases well-being and self-esteem and the family's commitment to the military. Many partners, both male and female, were angry at the continued use of the term dependent. They want to be seen as equal partners and argue that their commitment to supporting a service partner is contributing to operational capability. Maintaining continuity in healthcare can be challenging and time-consuming when families move. Serving personnel are cared for by Defence Medical Services throughout their career, but family members have to find new doctors and new dentists and rejoin waiting lists for secondary care every time they move. We discovered that some families had not been able to see a dentist for several years, and that disruptions in healthcare are particularly detrimental for children with mental health issues. We have argued for greater awareness among health and other professionals of the distinct needs of service families and a greater commitment to upholding the Armed Forces Covenant. We have also argued for greater partnership working and sharing of resources between military and civilian health services, and a much more holistic approach to mental health support for the whole family. So many of the struggles families describe come down to the desire just for greater stability in family life. A pernicious aspect of service life is the loneliness felt by some non-serving partners because of the moves and deployments. Loneliness and social isolation can cause significant mental stress and relationships to break down. Military welfare staff told us that intimate partner violence is an increasing concern. And although families did not mention domestic abuse as a specific issue, several referred to their serving partner's anger and rage, especially after deployment. The issue which caused the most distress, however, was the state of service family accommodation. Everyone needs a place called home. And while military families have traditionally lived in military housing, this pattern is changing. Increasing numbers are choosing to make their home away from a military base in order to create more stability. Nevertheless, we received plenty of evidence of poor maintenance on every visit and in most responses to the call for evidence. The problems are well known and publicly documented. Living in poorly maintained houses affects relationships, the quality of family life, is detrimental to morale, and ultimately to the work commitment of the serving partner. Poor housing makes families feel undervalued and unappreciated. So we have made a number of recommendations relating to housing, and we are pleased that they are being taken seriously. The lack of work-life balance, the constant churn in family life, and the lack of support can so easily leave partners feeling second best. The support offered to serving families tends to be reactive rather than proactive. And as Andrew mentioned, there is a strong charitable support sector offering a variety of help. But there remains considerable confusion among families as to where to go and how to seek support, and stigma about doing so. As families choose to live away from military bases, it is becoming more difficult for welfare and other support to be offered by the military. So our report calls for greater integration and collaboration and a much more proactive approach to providing comprehensive support across all three services. Partnership programs that increase resilience and build stronger families are essential to well-being. Research has shown that when families are cared for, service personnel are able to concentrate on their work and are more likely to stay in the military. Greater understanding of the specific pressures on service families is critical to providing the appropriate support and to breaking down barriers to seeking help. Our report provides evidence that questions whether the frequency and length of deployments and the current pattern of moving service personnel every 2 or 3 years, particularly in the Army and the RAF, is sustainable in the 21st century, and whether it is absolutely necessary to maintain operational capability. A revised model, which enables greater stability, would alleviate many of the challenges which cause such distress and threaten retention. We have called for a culture change within the armed forces to fully recognise and take account of the needs of partners and children when decisions are taken about mobility. Meanwhile, steps must be taken to ensure that families feel valued. It's not about special treatment, but about recognition and respect. We have pointed to the huge importance of small acts of kindness alongside saying thank you. Reaching out, welcoming families when they move, offering friendship, all help people to feel valued. And more than anything, families want the military and the Ministry of Defence to communicate directly with them and not just via the serving partner. Messages sent by the serving partner may well be lost in translation if they arrive at all, and this results in families feeling powerless and ignored. We believe that direct communication with families could be easily solved, and we have suggested how it can be achieved. In our view, the Armed Forces Covenant and the Armed Forces Family Strategy have central roles to play in recognising the sacrifices military families make, ensuring that they are recognised, respected, valued and supported in their local communities as well as on military bases. We have asked the Prime Minister to spearhead a change of culture to ensure that the UK population appreciates the role played by its armed forces and values the support their families give them. Our recommendations, then, are designed to ensure that the future family strategy strives for greater stability in family life, ensures more proactive, joined-up support, values the contributions families make and celebrates the work of the armed forces, takes a family-centred approach to through-life support, strengthens the armed forces covenant, and promotes small acts of kindness at every opportunity. It seems appropriate to end with a comment from a non-serving partner. She said to us, "Thank you for thinking of service families. It is really wonderful to know that you are investing time and consideration into this. We now encourage others to take note of the evidence and to invest time, consideration, and commitment to implementing our recommendations. Thank you very much."
Great, thank you for that, Jan. And if I could remind everybody, if you do have a question you'd like to pose to the panel at the end of the webinar, then please do type them in to the Zoom chat and we'll sort through those and get them to you. The Secretary of State, I understand, will be with us very shortly, but just to give him time to finish his journey, we're going to cut now to the Families Federations. When we put this event together, we were very keen to hear from the families, as you can imagine. It seemed a bit invidious to try and pick one particular family. So we went instead to the 3 service families, and I spoke to them last week, and this is what they had to say. Okay, I'm joined now by the 3 chief executives of the Families Federations: Anna Wright from the Naval Families Federations, Collette Musgrave from the Army, and Maria Lyle from the Royal Air Force Families Federations. And as well as being chief executives, all 3 are also members of Armed Forces families. So Anna, let me come to you first for your response to this review.
Well, I believe that this is the report of a generation, and we were delighted to play our part in facilitating access to Royal Naval families, as I'm sure my colleagues were, so that families' views and lived experiences could be heard. I've been incredibly impressed by the way the report completely understands the maritime environment and how this influences the way Royal Navy families live. With 77% home ownership, our families are located in every county in the UK, and we experience huge amounts of family separation. This report recognises the need for dispersed families to be supported appropriately. Already a capable community, implementation of these recommendations will further enhance their ability to thrive and play a vital role supporting their serving loved one. It also acknowledges that large amounts of separation impact all aspects of family life, including spouse career opportunities, children's well-being, childcare and relationships. I'm particularly excited to see the call for robust research in relation to service children's education and support for carers and children with special educational needs and disabilities. Also, the plans to modernise communications, harnessing digital technology to deliver accurate, timely and supportive information directly to families wherever they may be. The solutions are multifaceted, and I'm very excited to work with the devolved administrations, Westminster and other partners in taking this forward. And I believe this will be a game changer in terms of reassuring the serving partner and their family that their family is valued and thriving as they protect our nation's interests. I'm now going to hand over to Collette Musgrave from the Army Families Federation.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Ray, and thank you for the opportunity to be commenting on what I think is probably going to be a really, really important piece of work for families, providing that framework for family support moving forward. I'm relatively new in post. I came in post just before Christmas. It was actually my predecessor, Sarah Bard, who worked very closely with Andrew on this report. And I know she would very much like me to say that we very much welcome the fact that families are heard in this report. They have really been listened to. And I think that's the particular strength here, that it shows a sensitivity and an understanding of the many different facets of service family life. We don't all experience being a service family in the same way, and that has been very much recognised in this report. It's such a considered and detailed piece of work. It really does identify that we need different, and army families in particular have particular challenges which need different types of support at different times. Anna's referenced separation. For us as army families, it's the very high levels of mobility, the consistently moving around and trying to maintain all of those elements of family life that everybody else experiences, getting a childcare place, getting a school place, getting employment, accessing healthcare, all of those things that families everywhere experience. But for army families in particular, it really does recognise the particular challenges that mobility brings to that. The recognition that the army lifestyle is very different is very welcome in this. And requires, I think, the identification that there is a range of help and support that's required. This is not simply the responsibility of either the Ministry of Defence or the chain of command, whether it's a single service, whether it's local service providers. It is all of those elements working together to support families. And I think that's where we really welcome the fact that a strategy for families can be built around these recommendations. And that's what we'd like to work with, as I know my colleagues will, in the future months. For us in particular, we do welcome, for army families in particular, the continued access to service families accommodation, and the recognition of how important that is when you are moving around the country so frequently. Just taking that bit of grit out of the system for families when they're facing the constant moves, and also the unique problems that we have, I think, challenges that we have supporting Foreign and Commonwealth personnel and their families in the army. I know my colleagues in the other two services have this as well, but we do have a large number of non-British personnel and their families for whom there is little recognition and support. And so we do really welcome that element of that in this report as well. And I'd just like to hand over to Maria now.
Thank you very much, Collette. As my other colleagues have said, delighted to be here, and delighted really to reflect on a report that I think is bringing us into an age of working with modern families that are involved in the service of the nation. So that's quite important, and it's reflected in the introduction to the report, where a phrase is used that really resonates with me. They talk about a greedy institution. Professor Walker and Andrew Selous talk about the military as a greedy institution, as the family can be, and getting the tension between those two institutions right to support the serving personnel and their family is really key, and something that I know for RAF families and the ambitions of the RAF to build an air force that's got heightened levels of gender parity is something that's going to be key going forward, and we're really keen to see. So in terms of how the report might do that and what we're looking forward to working with personnel to do, the RAF's committed to having a higher level of retention of female personnel. They do very well already, but of the Five Eyes Air Forces, they're one of the lowest. So to do this, some of the ambitions of the report are really, really useful, I think. One of those is around childcare, but it's not the only one. And there are other caring responsibilities, not just childcare, that we do need to bear in mind. So, for example, we know that around 9% of serving RAF personnel have responsibilities that aren't childcare, whether that's parental or other family responsibilities for elderly parents. Going back to childcare then, this report acknowledges how important it is. Some of the challenges that military families face that aren't universal. And also I'd like to acknowledge the strides that have been made already. So really pleased to see flexible service, flexible working coming in, and the wraparound childcare pilot recently announced that between 200 and 250 families are already taking advantage of. So these are all great things. I would reflect for RAF families from the survey that we will be publishing very shortly, around 77% of them cited availability of close family members as being a barrier to childcare. And out in the wider civilian population, we know that at least 30% of them use close family members for childcare. And that is, in general, less of an option for military personnel who are scattered across the country. which is why childcare for both serving personnel and perhaps dual serving couples, as well as family members, is really, really key to keep the ambitions for spousal employment very much alive, and to make sure that serving personnel know that their children are supported regardless of the demands of their workplace at the time. Lastly, I'd like to flag up cost. And we know that that is a barrier. It comes out in FAMCAS, it's come out in our own surveys, but it's a barrier across the nation, not just for military personnel. So balancing realistic support for childcare against what we know is a national challenge for all families is something that we'll be really, really eager to work with the MOD, the single services and the wider sector to support going forward. So that's all from me. I'm going to hand back to Ray. Thank you very much.
That's super. Thanks, Maria, Anna, and Collette. And I really appreciate you've only had a very short space of time to give some reactions. And I know the federations are very deeply involved with the MOD in working up the family strategy as well. And Maria, also to you, because I think you've kindly agreed to come back onto the live panel, which will happen after this session. So for now, thank you very much, all of you. That's great, thank you. And we're getting some good questions in now on the chat, Tote. So I would encourage you to keep filling out on the Zoom chat anything you want to say or anything you want to ask. We'll see if we can get those into the panel. What I would also say is that if we don't end up answering even asking your question today, then we will send them in to robert.selby100@mod.gov.uk and we'll provide a response to all of those in due course. So I'd like to invite Roger at the MOD Media Suite perhaps to turn your camera on now, and I'm hoping that we will see the Chief of Defence People, Lieutenant General James Swift, who's now coming straight into the frame. James, good afternoon. Thank you for coming in. Your area holds the responsibility for service families, and I've got a few questions for you if you're happy to answer.
Yeah, good to see you, Ray.
So, I mean, let me kick off because the Families Feds concluded there with talking about the strategy and ask you, how is it then that another strategy is actually going to result in better outcomes for armed forces families?
So this comes at a really good time because the current strategy was dated and runs out in 2020. So it was time for us to review that anyway. And what we've got now is this fantastic evidence-based report that we can draw on to help inform our future steps. And what we needed to do is take the 110 recommendations from the report, put them together under a sort of capping strategy so that we've got a consistent and coherent way forward. And most importantly, also deliver an action plan that will underpin it and that will actually drive the progress.
Mm. I mean, let me switch sort of almost completely the other end of the scale, because a lot of the comments we've been receiving have been about service families, accommodation, future accommodation model. In fact, we've got comments not just from occupants, but actually from a serving commanding officer complaining about how the maintenance contract for his unit is simply not working. So what is the MOD going to do, first of all, about the maintenance issues, which is a perennial, and secondly, about the whole long-term issue with accommodation and the balance of mobility and the future accommodation model?
Wow, big question. Let's see if I can't take it in reverse. So as far as getting at the crux of the matter here, which is about mobility, I think, reading the report and listening to Professor Walker now, Jan laid out exactly the sort of challenges that families face, whichever way they choose to live. And it's really important to understand that, as indeed the Families Federation said, that there isn't one size that fits all. All our families live in different, choose to live in different ways. But whatever we can do to reduce the amount of instability on our families will make a really big difference for all of them. And therefore, that's something we're driving towards. And in some areas, we've got it right. So in most parts of the army, for example, we've stopped arms plot moving. My own regiment has been in Tidworth now since 2005. So the vast majority of people in that organisation won't need to move, and their families won't need to move either. But some of them will need to go to Sandhurst as instructors, for example. And when you take on a job such as that, it's just so demanding that it's really good if you can move with your family, so that in the small bits of time between instructing the next generation of leaders, there's an opportunity to see your family and catch up, and that it's still everybody's personal choice. But there will always be demands like that require a degree of mobility, but we need to reduce it as far as possible. And in my last job as General Officer Commanding of the 3rd Division, I wanted to understand why some trickle posted units couldn't also get at this. And so I looked at the REME, and there are a number of REME regiments in that region. And I thought that it must be possible for a service person to have a full and varied career without having to move from where they lived. And that is possible, but the reality is that the REME are in 70 different locations in the UK, and some of those locations are quite small, and therefore they do need to move their people around in order to not just for their development, but in order to meet their operational output. That said, what they've done is they've increased the time for each individual posting. They've increased it by 50% in order to reduce that churn rate. And I know in the RAF also postings have been extended. So there are a number of ways that we're across defence are trying to get at that issue of churn. As far as your sort of initial end of the question, though, it's maintenance of the accommodation offer is really important. As most people on the call will be aware, in November last year, we launched the Future Defence Infrastructure Services, which is the new contract for addressing many of the issues raised in the report, and really keen that we see those deliver increased standards. I'm in my 14th quarter. I am acutely aware of some of the challenges that we face. I've had some good ones and some not so good ones. And equally, you know, with all the people that I've been working with over the years as well. So making sure that we maintain service families accommodation to the standard that our people deserve is important. But at the same time, what we want to do is increase the choice that people have. And so things like Forces Help to Buy, which thousands of families have now been able to benefit from and buy their own home, but also in due course, the future accommodation model will give people more choice as to how they live, and service families accommodation won't be the only offer going forwards.
Okay, thank you. I mean, let me take you something that's very close to the heart of Forces in Mind Trust, and that's about the resettlement process, in fact, the whole of transition. And we've heard over many studies that the families feels completely excluded from that whole process. And somebody spoke earlier about communications not actually getting from the service person to the family. What can the MOD do about that? How can you make the family an integral part of transition?
So that's exactly what we're planning to do. In fact, we are doing. I did my financial aspects of resettlement course last term, and my wife did it with me, and she found it incredibly helpful. And so that's just one example of where partners are already involved, and they must be involved, because these are decisions that people take as a family, and therefore it's really important that both, or all members of the family, I suppose, are informed in order that they can take those decisions together in a sensible way. And the other thing that we're doing in terms of transition is we're seeking to take a holistic sort of through career approach to this, so that people are being upskilled throughout their career, and that includes families, in order that when transition finally comes, it's less of a big change.
I mean, I don't want to be awkward, James, but, you know, that course you did, I did that with my wife 10 years ago, so I don't think that's new. But, you know, we need to break through this inability to communicate with families directly. You know, is that going to happen?
Yeah, it is. And I was thinking about this today, because it's really, really important. And but I think it also, the conclusion I reached was that everyone wants that communication in a different way. So we need to communicate in, not just for transition, for everything. We need to communicate in multiple channels. And again, drawing on my own personal experience, you know, Collette, please excuse me here. When the AFF journal drops through our door, it's not my wife who picks it up and reads it. That's not her preferred means of communication. I have that pleasure, but she gets almost all her information off Facebook, sort of patch Facebook pages, and indeed off the websites of the Families Federations. So making sure that we can communicate with people in the most appropriate way is really important, and particularly as, of course, many, or perhaps increasingly, our families don't live near our bases. And therefore relying on a families newsletter that was driven around the patch and popped through the door is just not adequate anymore. And so how do we get that? I think the key is that we need to ask the non-serving partner how they want to be communicated with, because it will be different in all places. So it's not about asking the serving partner for permission to communicate with their spouse. Or the non-serving partner is a person in their own right. So let's ask them how they want to be communicated with.
Yeah, and actually people are talking already on the chat toad about using hives, and also the importance of, as you say, holistic, and actually including the emotional aspects, providing emotional support for families as they go through transition as well. James, I don't know if the Secretary of State's ready to talk to us yet. If not, I've got a couple of other questions for you.
I believe he is here now. Yeah. So I'll just mute. So we'll just mute this end, and he'll come in, and then we'll come back to me in the panel.
That's great. Thank you, James. So while the MOD are just setting up, just a reminder then that we are watching frantically through all your chats, and that as I promised, we will send them back to the MOD. We'll make sure that whoever's responsible tries to get some sort of answer, and we'll try and publish in some way. We haven't quite worked out yet how we're going to do that. The independent review to consider the diverse needs of service families and whether the support met those needs was commissioned by the then Secretary of State for Defence in January 2019. I'm delighted because I know the Minister has had to rush across from the House where he's been speaking to be joined now live from main building by the Right Honourable Ben Wallace MP, who is going to provide us now with the formal Ministry of Defence response. Over to you, Minister.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I've just poured a glass. It says Plymouth Gin on it. I promise it's not neat gin. I've just done that. And thank you, Andrew, for doing it. Sorry, I have been delayed. And sorry, CDP, I've just had to do a statement to the House on what many of your other halves are probably engaged in, COVID response, etc. And, delivering another plank to the job that they probably didn't think they were joining up for. But nevertheless, I think it's a proud record of what the military are doing to help on the COVID response, and indeed the military and the civil servants and the MOD as well, because they've also been busy at it. So I do apologise for that. Look, can I say right from the outset, not long after I was appointed, this report and Living in Our Shoes, and Andrew approached me about it, and I just want to say what a brilliant piece of work it has been. Andrew and obviously Professor Walker and Dr. Miska, who had done a really good job, I think, on producing not just a report, but a report with evidence. Because I think that's, when I'm, as the Secretary of State, trying to battle status quo, let's say, within big, large departments, the evidence that this report collected was really important in making the case for things like wraparound childcare, which we put in our manifesto, but it was quite, I'll let you into a secret. It was resisted by some people in the department when I said it was really important to go. And I think reports like this were really important in making the case, not just in a sort of political sense, but in an evidence base. So I think it's really important. I think the journey for me is, I left the army in 1998. Let me put it this way. When I was serving in the infantry in 1998, I think there was one woman in the whole regiment. And it was a pretty old-fashioned setting. The accommodation was pretty poor, and I know some of the accommodation still is for many of you. The way people worked was very, very different. We still had huge numbers of troops in Germany. I started my life in Germany in those big garrisons where at least there was a critical mass of military personnel all in one place. There was a big school provision and facilities as well, and that has changed. Also, the sort of balance within a family has changed. There are lots more women earning more than their husbands who might not be in the armed forces. There are a lot more women in the armed forces with their own careers, quite rightly. And I think that's why Living in Our Shoes was a really good piece of work for me and the department to get our head around. The challenge for me to the service chiefs and indeed to the department and CDP is to get on and help deliver as many of those recommendations as possible. I know there are 110. Some of them are dependent on the devolved administrations, but in reality, we should be getting on with it and making sure, and I think by February, March, I hope to have a detailed response to the report on all 110 recommendations, so everyone can see where we stand and what are the issues. But I know as someone who left the army in '98, I wasn't married and had children in '98, but my wife was chair of governors at a local primary school in Lancashire, and seeing service children coming in and all the challenges they face, both with relocating, if they were military personnel serving or if they were veterans and their parents had left the military, and getting good school places. All of that, I think, is very real. And the same goes for health provision as well. Understanding the military is harder for the society as less people are in it. I think, when I joined the army, the chief of the general staff had been, the Field Marshal Inge had been a Second World War veteran. The levels of people's contact with the military en masse, either for national service or people in the workplace, was much larger. Now it's much smaller, and therefore, in most societies, getting them to understand the needs of serving families is really a challenge that we all have to do. We have to educate people as we go. And I think this report goes a long way in both reminding obligations that I have, but also reminding wider government that it needs to put more effort into understanding the military family. But look, I know that time is tight. So I think the best thing for me is to open it up to the questions rather than you listen to long speeches on the report. But I just want to thank the authors and the team. It's a really, really good piece of work. And I've been in politics and government long enough to see good pieces of work and bad pieces of work, partly because it frightens me that you've found such good things to hold us to account and that I have to now deliver them.
Thanks, Meadows. I suppose my first question is, why was it necessary to have an independent review? You've got thousands of staff officers in there doing this kind of stuff.
I don't think we should ever mark our own homework. And, whether the reality of the military family is it's hierarchical. It is defence is hierarchical. If you're a corporal in inadequate accommodation or poor accommodation, who do you make your complaint to? How do you get your voice heard without going through the chain of command? That's just a reality of the military. That's not going to change. I have to be honest about that. That's how we operate our organisations. But therefore, it is important every now and then to have an independent voice, independent review. I'm not frightened of that, and I announced at the recent defence sort of integrated review speech that we're going to have an external, well, it'll be internal, but within the department we're going to have some challenge of our own about what we do with our armed forces, how we deploy our armed forces, how we equip them. I think that we should never be frightened of challenge, and to me, this is welcome. This piece of work.
Were you surprised by quite how many recommendations there were? You say 110.
Yeah, I think I'll be honest. I think I'm quite surprised. 110 recommendations. I don't. It doesn't undermine that many of these issues need fixing. I just think it's it shows it shows the thoroughness of the report rather than the problems are acute. I think it just shows that it's a thorough pan-horizon report, and it listened to the people, the men and women who live in the armed forces and have to live with the consequences of areas they think need to be improved.
Recommendation 96 has become quite a famous recommendation. It's the one that calls for the Prime Minister to spearhead a change of culture in society. Do you think society actually does need to make that change? And on behalf of the sort of 400 people today, will you be asking the Prime Minister indeed to provide that leadership?
Well, I'm in a sense I don't need to ask him because he already has agreed to with me. He's already spoken to me, and also there is a slight crossover into the veterans community here. And I know there'll be people listening who say, hang on, I actually live and breathe the armed forces because I'm serving in it, or my husband or wife is. But there is a sort of crossover. But, you know, the veterans are the bridge into that society. And the Prime Minister set up the Office of Veterans Affairs. And part of that was about, you know, making sure that society values the military. Now, whether they value serving or whether they value retired, it shouldn't really matter in some levels. This is about, you know, bridging both. The Covenant, he is a great supporter of the Covenant, and it was obviously the manifesto that he led that put in place the Covenant is going to be further implemented in law and through the Armed Forces Act across the board. So I will make sure that he is engaged more. I mean, he meets regularly with military personnel. He saw some yesterday, actually, Navy individuals involved in the vaccine in Bristol. So yeah, I will do. But you know, I've just come from a meeting before my statement to the House with him, where he just said, you know, unprompted, the best export Britain has in the world is the armed forces.
Well, how critical do you think the Office of Veterans Affairs is? I know Minister Mercer has the expression that he wants the UK to be the best place in the world to be a veteran. Is that something that perhaps the MOD could use and say, you want the UK to be the best place in the world to be a serving family?
Yes, I mean, it's really interesting on the wraparound childcare policy. You know, I looked at other armed forces. You know, the French have a remarkable record in retaining women in the armed forces, serving women. It's also one of the armed forces that they spend the most on childcare. You know, they have some of the highest funding on childcare. Now, of course, that's linked, obviously, that if you look after that, people will want to stay. They won't have to make a difficult choice. And I think I want us to be as flexible as possible in how we live. You know, the future accommodation model, the Help to Buy scheme, looking at some of the allowances to make sure they're up to date. All of those things are really important in making sure that we reflect how people are today. And, you know, I think there are a lot more unaccompanied personnel simply because a lot of married people have chosen to buy a house somewhere and settle and then rotate through. That's quite different from my day. But also we've got a lot more UK-based full stop. We've got a lot of, you've got big garrisons of Catterick and Tidworth in the army or in the armed forces. And we've got less RAF bases spread out. And to some extent, the Navy is very much focused in really the areas of Plymouth and Portsmouth. So I think, and Faslane, obviously, I think we've got a more settled home base. And that means we need to reflect in both our employment practices and our terms and conditions, those type of changes.
Again, Minister, thank you. A lot of comment coming in about children, and I guess quite a few of the report recommendations really don't lie within the Ministry of Defence. They're perhaps more for colleagues around the Department for Education. Is this something that Whitehall as a whole is really going to grip? Do you sense that colleagues are interested in this?
Yeah, I mean, I recently wrote to all my Secretaries of State, my colleagues, about the Covenant and upholding the Covenant, and they all wrote back letters that I shall hold them to, you know, upholding the Covenant, supporters of the Covenant, supporters of service families. And that means that when it comes to education, you know, both the Minister of DPV, you know, Johnny Mercer will engage across Department of Education, I think he already has, to make sure that these recommendations are put in full. Some of it is just awareness. Some of it is just about awareness. And a number of the recommendations are simply about awareness for whether it's GPs, about the needs of service families, relocation, you know, the pain of relocation, let's call it that, you know, often recycling all the way through getting a new GP, registering for a GP before you move on in a few years' time. Some of that's just about making it aware to different parts of society. I think the other challenge is as people are more spread out, you know, buying their own home and staying, less people living on camp potentially, or less people following around the deployments. I think it means, again, we have less and less aware schools and GPs because the service child is only one or two of them rather than 50 of them. You know, the primary school my wife was a chair of as a governor, you know, it's a small primary school in North Lancashire. And we had two service children there, and they came when their cases, their father was in their last 2 years, you know, one was an RAF officer, he was just leaving, and they were settling back, and you know, he was coming into the MOD, but his family had moved to locate where they were going to be when they finished. And just the awareness of those service, the last time those service children were there was probably 10 years before that. So a lot of this is awareness.
Okay, thank you, Minister. You'll see that Andrew Selous has joined us now. I don't know if you have comments there.
Well, I'm just delighted to hear what you said, Secretary of State. Thank you very much, and to you, General Swift. It's been a great privilege to do this report. We're obviously very invested in it. My team, Professor Walker and Dr. Miska, we really want to see it implemented, and we look forward eagerly to your response to the 110 recommendations. But thank you for letting us do the report, and we will stand with you as you implement it and be cheering you on. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Well, look, the plus side is, Andrew, well, first of all, it is an incredibly thorough report, and I mean that in a complimentary way, is that, we had the settlement, the defence settlement, and, part of that is absolutely about investing in the infrastructure as well, the housing and the places of work. I think what's been really sad over the years is when defence had to meet its budgets, it hollowed out the unsexy things, the infrastructure and the buildings and all the things that no one ever wants to write a press release about anyhow, seem to be the sort of go-to place. Some of those were hollowed out of infrastructure that we needed to service our ships or our submarines, and you pay for that in the end. You pay for that with people voting with their feet, or you pay for that with equipment taking longer to service, and either way you pay for that. And I think that's what I'm determined not to do. And if that means in the next years or two, when we announce equipment programs, they're less glamorous than they could be, it's because the money is going on things like living in our shoes, and indeed the infrastructure and the accommodation that's so important.
Thank you.
That's excellent to hear. Yeah.
Although I get lots of complaints about the quality of boots or something as a result, but I'll blame you for that.
Always. Minister, I gather we've got you for a couple more minutes. I wonder if I can ask you about the family test. It's perhaps not particularly well known outside of what is, whether you could sort of give us an insight into what the family test is and how actually you think it is being applied, because the report does talk about it's perhaps not being as applied as vigorously as it should be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about valuing, what a family is and reflecting what a modern family is as well. I think that's the first thing. And I'm not sure in the past across Whitehall, people have thought about it in the same way they might have thought about, equality or environment and things like that. It's really important. It's just really important for us all. And the family test here in living in our shoes, I think that goes to the heart of it. How we live as a family is different. How we're employed is different. How we earn money is different. And, one size fits all is very much not what we're about anymore. We can't be. We won't recruit anyone, and we won't hold anyone on. I mean, I want to say anything to that.
Well, only to add that the families test is often applied mainly to people providing services directly to families, and obviously in our case that's not necessarily always pertinent. But in our work with other government departments, making sure that they're aware of what that is and the importance of the Armed Forces Covenant, as you mentioned earlier, Secretary of State, is absolutely critical.
I mean, I think certainly where I hope to see the families test change behaviour is in things like local authorities and schools and GPs and primary care. I think those things are really important, because I think there are many hidden things that a service family has that others don't, and that isn't brought to life very much. It would be good to get some awareness in our young practitioners that we're all recruiting to become GPs and doctors around the country. I wonder how much contact they've ever had with the military as well.
Yeah, indeed. Secretary of State, thank you. I wonder if I can just close then with a final question. You've kind of hinted it already. Just invite you to reassure the serving and the ex-serving families who are on the call today and will watch this on YouTube in the coming days, as that is a report that isn't simply going to gather dust on the shelf, that you are going to do something with it.
Yeah, no. I want the team to give me a response to all 110 recommendations by February, March. And if that means, and if the devolved administrations aren't on time, we'll just have to leave them out and they can come back with their own response to it, I think, because I think we shouldn't hold up the vast majority of those recommendations. if that is the call. And yeah, I mean, we won't agree with every single recommendation. I think let's be slightly honest about that. I'm not, but I think the key is to give an explanation if we're not going to implement a recommendation, why not, or that there's an alternative that we think is worth going at it. But no, I think it's really, really important, because my plan for the armed forces under this IR is a more busy armed forces, a more engaged, forward present armed forces. Now, that's not moving lots of families around the world, but it is making sure that we defeat the threat and indeed challenge the threat from our adversaries. And it is a more dangerous world by being more forward and present, helping reassure and our allies, helping radicalism not spread through Africa, for example, and seeing an increase in terrorism, helping places that need our support, and indeed, by us being forward, sending a strong message about Britain's place in the world. So we're going to be busier. That means the home fires have to be absolutely kept burning.
Minister, well, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much indeed. We look forward to seeing the Ministry's responses in due course. For now, thank you.
Brilliant. Sorry I was late. Thank you.
No, thank you for saying well late as well. Your PS is probably going mad in the corner. So, James, I understand you're able to stay. Is that correct still?
Yes, and then I'll join the Minister in due course.
Okay,
fantastic. So if I could invite all the other panelists to turn their cameras on as well, so we can all see you. We've got about 15 minutes left, and we've had some fantastic responses to the questions, and we've got lots of questions coming in. And we're just going to pull them up now. So you will have seen all of the panelists before, either in real life or recorded, with one exception, and that is Kate Davies. Kate is the Director of Armed Forces at NHS England, so a particular welcome to you, Kate. And actually, I'm going to start off with you, if I may, because you haven't really spoken a great deal about health and well-being, and I think I counted about 11 recommendations in the report about either NHSs or health departments, and I just wondered whether there's anything that particularly chimes with you with a healthcare hat on.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for the report, and particularly to Andrew, who I met on a number of occasions to obviously work with the needs and requirements of families and carers within the armed forces community. So as Director in NHS England for the armed forces community, I think recommendations 63 to 77 are particularly edged very clearly in how we support this going forward, and actually, I think what I want to update is that actually the action and the progress has already begun. The Secretary of State particularly talked about GPs and his ambition that all new GPs will have some experience or some knowledge and expertise in the military, and that's exactly what we're doing. I think in the chat box, where there was a question about the Rcgp, Royal College of General Practitioners Accreditation Programme. NHS England actually started that programme a few years ago now, particularly because of families and carers saying to us that they get a mixed response with GPs and a mixed response with primary care. And what we absolutely want to do is make quite sure the quality, the understanding, the training, as in the recommendations, are supported. So funding the NHS England GP accreditation programme with an ambition in the long-term plan to meet all practices and all GPs with a standard of understanding of the armed forces community, both serving reservists as well, which I think we mustn't forget. There's a particular need for families and carers with the reservist community, but also for veterans and their families and carers is absolutely essential. I think the strength for me with the report and the work that we're doing collectively with the MOD, and as the General knows, we have a partnership agreement with the MOD, as we're now very strongly with the Office for Veterans Affairs, is how we really push those ambitions and those recommendations in the report, how we evidence and then test them out, I think, Ray, with our families, communities within the NHS, that they are working and it is beginning to make the difference. We particularly heard those challenges around dentists, around transition, around mental health, but particularly how people don't want to go to the back of the waiting queue, whether that's to do with children, young people and child and adolescent mental health services, or whether that's particularly to do with cancer or stroke or long-term conditions. It's heart-wrenching, quite frankly, when we hear those personal situations that could have been dealt with better. But I'm really pleased to say that what we are getting as a feedback from the Families Federation and many others individually is there is the improvement and the constant improvement. I can't be on a call at this point, colleagues on the panel and also Ray, without thanking both the NHS and the military community at the moment, who are doing an amazing job together around the biggest, kind of pandemic and rollout of care and need that we've ever seen. I'm working also, 7 days a week on things, including the vaccine, and it's the military community, it's the families who are sacrificing, and our NHS staff that are sacrificing their time and their energy all the time. So yes, the recommendations are core. Just lastly, we have also been undertaking a family and carer engagement exercise led by our public and patient group, particularly the chair, Nikki Murdoch, led by many individuals who are living it, breathing it and feeling it all the time. We've had over 600 responses since September of last year, and we will be publishing that. And Andrew and James and other colleagues on the panel, we will be doing a further deep dive on what that means for the recommendations 63 to 77, but also how that will pull out the Armed Forces Covenant, the NHS Constitution, but also very close population-based community responses for the Armed Forces families. And it's their voices that matter, and it's really the population within the community for families and carers that we want to test that we're getting this right. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kate. Yeah, a couple of questions around mental health. You mentioned there how the fact that when a serving person has mental health issues, there's quite a barrier to be overcome to access those services. And the families themselves, of course, are also very affected by the serving person's mental health issues. What could be done to improve the mental health support to those families when the serving person has a problem?
Well, I mean, I think the thing we hear more than anything else from the families is a complete sacrifice, to be honest, that families are giving to get their loved ones supported first. And that's absolutely understandable in many levels when some of the mental health needs or some of the misunderstandings are acute or have been going on for some time. So firstly, the response has been improving and extending the mental health services that are available, not only to serving and reservists and along with our colleagues in the MOD and Defence Medical Services, but particularly on transition before leaving the military, but also within the veterans community. And I'm really pleased to say that we've commissioned and funded additional services now well in excess of 20 million in the last 3 years to support that request from the military community, particularly families. But then secondly, I'd really like to emphasise that it is important for the families and carers to be seen in their own right as part of those mental health needs for the ones that they love and they care for, and sometimes actually separate from as well within the time that people are serving because of mental health or mental health needs, or just because people in life do separate in families. And that's the same in the modern family for the military community. So I think it's really important that we look at the GPs, the mental health services, supporting the family members and carers in their own right, and particularly children. And I hear that very clearly today in today's seminar. And I really welcome that I think it's children and people whose maybe voice aren't quite as loud as many of our adults, that we need to be focusing on as well. And that's really what the family and carer engagement work that we're just looking at the moment is particularly saying, that they'd like quite a simple solution close to home, wherever home is when you're serving, or wherever home is when you're a veteran, and really to educate and support much more local networks around well-being and mental health, Ray. And I think that's very, very clear, and something that I know the investment within the mental health services that we have from the government and with the long-term plan are now really focusing on families and carers within the military community.
Okay, thanks, Kate. James, I wonder if I can pick up on the point about the different nations, the devolved nations, and because of course, defence is not devolved, but dealing with families and dealing with veterans most certainly effectively is. So how does the MOD help get this report into the DNA of those of all 4 countries within the United Kingdom?
So firstly, we're already engaged, and we're consistently engaged with the devolved administrations anyway. So this is sort of building on a network that already exists. But if I try to bring that to life, on recent virtual visits to Scotland and Wales, I met with the ministers responsible for education in both locations. And they were really attuned to the service families issue and the service children's issue already because of the engagement that had sort of preceded. And particularly if you take Wales as an example, their funding of SSCE, which is the support to serving children in education in Wales, and most of that is about educating the teaching providers. Because like in so much of the rest of the UK, in Wales in particular, most of the families who live there are not near to main bases. They're living in villages, therefore 1 or 2 children at the school are from serving families. And then there are the other initiative, well, each of those, Scotland and Wales that I can speak for personally, are looking for opportunities. And again, going back to Wales, they're about to change their curriculum there. And there's one of the things that they're trying to increase is life skills. And they are actively looking for military or cadet type engagement with schools in order to explain some of the values, standards, resilience, and other leadership skills and the like that one gets in the military. And so that too will increase, therefore, across the whole of Wales, the engagement with and understanding of service families. So this is core business and is ongoing all the time.
Okay, thanks, Shade. Quite a lot of questions around reservists, but I think I'm going to take those offline. Actually, we'll package them all up and we'll send them in around reserve forces. But one question again that we've seen asked a number of times is where you have both parents effectively are serving with the armed forces, and I wonder whether the MOD recognises this is a distinct type of family and what's been done to understand what their unique needs might be.
So absolutely, we recognise that, and we take it into consideration when people are assigned to units. Certainly, when considering overseas tours, and indeed, the Secretary of State's commitment to wraparound childcare will help some of those families as well. But it is particularly difficult. The nature of military service, whether it's the daily routine or deploying on exercises or indeed deploying on operations, means that that is a particularly challenging type of family within the armed forces, and one therefore that we need to pay particular attention to.
Okay, thank you. Maria, obviously we've heard that the families have been part of the consultation, and the federations have given us their view. I wonder if I could really ask you to reflect on behalf of all the 3 families federations. Is what you've seen and heard today, is that what you're hearing in your day-to-day business?
Absolutely, Ray. I mean, I think what came out particularly through Jan's really interesting summary of her work was the practical pressures that are applied to families. So whether that's being uncertain of the quality of the quarter you're going to move into, whether that's school places, accessing healthcare, or balancing the quite understandable desires of a partner to work with demands of service life, these are all things that people come to us about. And there is a drive, obviously, to retain personnel, and as highlighted in the report, and I know that it's often quoted as a sort of an American phrase, but the idea of recruiting a single person and then retaining the family, it's overused, but it's absolutely true. So if you look at the stats about why people choose to leave, it is based around that. And so you're never going to keep everyone, and in fact the military wouldn't work if we did. There's a reason that people leave, and it's a healthy turnover. But for those skilled personnel that want to keep serving, then removing those barriers, or at very least communicating better to families about those barriers and some of the initiatives that are there to support them, is absolutely key. So yes, we're delighted to see these recommendations. I'm very excited to get stuck in to actually bringing them into life, because the report itself is really vivid, but we want to see the projects come into life to actually address the recommendations as well.
Okay, thanks. Jan, I wonder if I could ask you, with the benefit of hindsight now, do you think there are areas, aspects of the review that you didn't go into, or you didn't go into any great depth, that you would like to have perhaps had more time, or you would want to return to?
Yes, I think there's probably two groups that I'd really like to think about and talk to further. And it's been mentioned several times today, both by Secretary of State and by CDP, and that is dual serving families. We did speak to some, but because one or other partner was probably away at the time, we didn't actually see them as a couple. And one of the things that came through with the dual serving families was it's not so difficult if they're both in the same branch of the armed forces. So they're both naval serving or army serving. What is particularly difficult for them is when one is in, say, the RAF and the other is in the army, because what they were saying to us very often was the two branches don't really talk to each other when it comes to making decisions about deployment or mobility. And that's even more enhanced if one partner is an officer, is in the sort of, another part is not. And so you have different groups, different people with different patterns of employment. And I think I would very much like to see some more work done with those people, because what we saw and what we heard was very often it's the female serving partner who ends up leaving before, and they decide between them that the male's career is probably more important to them, and so the female goes. And they've been trained, they've been working, they're valuable to the armed forces, but they leave early because they can't manage this dual serving household. And that links to my other group that, again, I think we need to talk to more, and that is about serving female people in the armed forces. Because again, we heard it wasn't always plain sailing to be a woman in the armed forces and to progress the career. And that becomes increasingly difficult when they have children and become mothers. And many, many people, Andrew will agree, said to us, we can't balance this. Something has to give. I can't give my commitment to the armed forces as well as my commitment as a parent. And so again, it is usually they leave the armed forces and the armed forces loses valuable people and they lose a career. So I think if I was going to spend more time talking to families, they would be two groups I would really want to explore further as to how support can be given to them very specifically.
Okay, thanks, Jan. And certainly speaking as a member of the Confederation of Service Charities, COPSIO, where we have established a female cluster to try and bring some of these concerns. I completely recognise what you have to say there. We need to wrap up shortly, but I would like for the final question on the panel, it's not really a question, it's really to invite Chief of Defence people, James, on behalf of the MOD, whether you've had any final message before I go to Andrew to wrap up.
I'd love to pick up the question you've just raised, Jan, but given the instructions from the chair, I won't. But what I would like to do, please, is to echo what the Secretary of State said to those involved in the report, not only for the tremendous quality and value of the report, but also for the way that you conducted it. I know from my team here in the Ministry of Defence that they've really enjoyed working with you to make sure that your observations are turned into wherever possible implementation recommendations that we can implement. And I also know, because my wife was involved in one of the groups that you spoke with in Tidworth, that the way you approached those groups was massively positive as well. And so from both cohorts, thank you very much. But thanks also to Kate and to the families of federations, because we can't deliver what we need to deliver for our families without you. You are so important, along with the Department of Education particularly, in helping us to do what we need to do to make sure that our service families are properly provided for, and therefore we can continue to deliver our operational output. So this really matters, and I'm really looking forward to taking forward the evidence in the report with the stakeholders on the panel, but also with the charities more broadly and everyone else involved in this sector. It's a real team game, but a really important one.
Right, thanks, James. And certainly Forces in Mind Trust, we look forward to bringing this report back to your team when we next see them, which I think is Friday, so that'd be great. I wonder, we'll close the panel there, so I wonder if I could ask panelists just to turn their cameras off and perhaps just to leave Andrew, Selous, myself. Andrew, having listened to the last sort of hour and a half now, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I'm delighted to see the really positive response from the Secretary of State for Defence and the Chief of Defence people. That's very heartwarming for Jan and myself and Dr. Miska, who worked on the report together. This, in the end, comes down to some really practical things, doesn't it? I was talking to my niece yesterday, who's married to someone in the Royal Air Force. They had a movement order in November. They're moving in March. Of course, that's the middle of the school year. You know, just getting their children into a school in time, you know, those school places haven't quite aligned with their move in March. Now, service families are no different to any other family in the land. They are more concerned about their children than probably anything else in the world. And just aligning that sort of issue so that is not a stress and a strain, I think is really, really important. And also, I think of the Federation of Small Businesses, a wonderful organisation I'm a big fan of. And on Armed Forces Day last year, they put out a newsletter to all members of Parliament saying the wonderful things they were doing for employing veterans, which is absolutely brilliant. And I absolutely commend them for that. But you know, next year, I hope when they put out that bit of information on Armed Forces Day, they will also have a little bit of information on what they're doing to help employ the spouses and partners of members of the armed forces, as well as veterans. So it is that sort of culture change, and it comes down to those very small details, all of which together, of course, you know, mount up and sometimes become overwhelming for armed forces families and cause, you know, a very talented member of our armed forces who we desperately need to keep us all safe and free, perhaps to leave the profession which they love. And that's what we want to avoid.
Okay, thank you. And you know, are there any aspects of the report you feel we haven't spoken about today that you want to highlight?
No, I think we've given it a very good coverage. Obviously, it's not been possible to go over every single area, but I think you've shared it wonderfully, Ray, if I may say so. You've drawn everyone in, and with particular thanks as well from me, actually, to Forces in Mind Trust for sort of standing with us. We wouldn't have got here without your help, and we are extremely grateful to you as well. So thank you so much for that.
No, it's been a pleasure. I mean, that's what we do. So we're delighted to be able to help, and your team have been good as well. Is there anyone else you want to thank before I close?
Well, I mean, a huge thanks from me really to Professor Walker. We ran for sort of planes and trains to go all over the country, to Dr. Miska as well, and just really all the families who engaged with us in hives and coffee shops and so on, you know, on bases all over the country. Thank you for your time. I hope you feel you have been listened to, that, you know, we weren't just another set of people that came and went away without anything happening, that we've delivered something, and something which will make an improvement to your lives.
Good. Andrew, thank you very much. And everybody, that concludes our Living in Our Shoes webinar. Do please keep tweeting, #LivingInOurShoes. Do keep sending your post-event comments into robert.selby100@mod.gov.uk. As I mentioned at the beginning, we'll get the whole thing up onto the Forces in Mind Trust YouTube channel as soon as we can. But for now, it's been our great pleasure to host this event, and I wish you all a very good evening.